humans originally were nomadic. Like Habitat and these first settlements only appeared like, 5,000 years ago, something like that, 6,000 years ago. So prior to that, would you say that there were no indigenous people?
Well, we can go all the way back that before that we were other species of humanoids, and eventually evolved to being Homo sapiens. But at some point, cultures were born. So then the question I'd ask back to you is, would you say that to a Maori and trying to tell them, well, although originally there were no indigenous people to Maoris before, does that mean that it invalidates their indigenous connection to the land? And I think you would say no. So it's like, why apply that standard on the Jews when that's not applied to other indigenous peoples?
Fumble a bag, now I will not fumble a bag. Fumble a bag, now I will not fumble a bag. Act like you know how this goes.
I'm here at UC Berkeley, where a lot of people have been saying this is one of the most anti-Semitic and anti-Israel universities in the world. And so we're here to engage with some of the students to see what they think, what they believe, and if we can find some common ground. Let's see what we get.
I don't know, I think it's kind of misinformed.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
How come?
I don't know, it's like a weird thing. Would you say that like Turkish people are indigenous to the Central Asia, Turkestan region? They live in Turkey.
Would you say that Tibetans are indigenous to Tibet, or Maori is indigenous to New Zealand?
Yeah, the Maori are indigenous.
So why is it a problem if Jews are indigenous to Israel?
Oh, I'm not saying it's a problem, I'm just saying it's a weird definition.
Is it weird when the Maoris say that they're indigenous to New Zealand?
Yeah, but that's kind of like a different situation. How would you define indigenous?
Well, indigenous is an ancient population that has the first relationship to that land, where that relationship is eternal and also necessary for them to function and be. And if you look at the Jewish people, the first peoples from that land are the Hebrews, which are our ancestors. We're the descendants of those Hebrews. And this is the indigenous land that we come from. The question I have for you is like, why is it okay for Maoris, Aboriginals, Tibetans, Native Americans, but when it's for Jews, then that becomes a problem?
Well, usually we use the term indigenous in reference to groups that have been historically oppressed by colonizers, right?
Example,
and,
the
Jews. that is an example from the Jews. But the thing is, the time between now and the expulsion of the Jews from Israel is what, 800 years?
2,000 years.
2,000 years.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, no, it's 1,800 years roughly, right? It's they were expelled by Trajan.
Around 2,000 years.
Yeah. Let's go a bit further back, right?
Okay.
It was a country called Philistine, right?
No, that's after.
That's before the time of Trajan.
No, the Romans conquered the land of Judea and renamed the land Palestine.
Yeah, but this was before that.
The Philistines were a population from Greece that eventually becomes called Greece, that were like an invader population that entered into the land and were fighting with the Hebrews, the Israelites.
Well, they were Semites.
The Philistines were not Semites. The Philistines were what predates the Greek Empire. So they were not Semites.
So you wouldn't call them natives of the land?
No. They were like the Vikings of the Mediterranean. They came from Crete and they raped and pillaged the whole region, including our region. And then years later, the Roman Empire, which is already after the Greeks, later the Romans, when they colonized our land in order to insult our memory, they named the land Palestine. Yeah. It's like someone taking my property or my house and then calling it Hitler because they know that this would insult my people. Yeah. And so that land was called Palestine post-Judea.
Sure, but how does that translate to modern day Jews who have lived perhaps in Poland for 8 generations? Does that mean that they're indigenous?
So then the question I would ask you is, if a Native American was colonized or Maori or Tibetan and were taken out from their land, would 8 generations be the limit that you're imposing on them no longer having a claim if they maintain the traditions and everything else?
I feel like the term kind of becomes obsolete at that point. If you culturally part of a different subsect of humanity, right?
Well, not if you kept it.
Polish, essentially, aren't you? If you've lived in Poland for 8 generations.
Genetically, no. Historically and culturally, no as well, because they were never able to assimilate into Poland. They were constantly killed and persecuted. I mean, 6 million Jews were killed not too long ago in Europe for not being white. And throughout history, Jews are always never given equal rights to land, never able to participate in anything, including within agrarianism economy. So the experience of Jews, even though it was in displacement, and some Jews had an experience in Europe, some Jews in North Africa, some Jews in other places, they were never Europeans. And they always had this idea that one day they have to come back home and bring back their culture. So then the question becomes, okay, let's say it's valid for 1 generation, 2 generation. Is 8 generation the limit of when it stops? Is it 6? Is it 10? Is it 12? Like, does it ever stop? What do you think?
I prefer to use functional definitions first.
Sure.
So if there, let's say it has 4 generations, right?
Okay.
And you have no connection to the culture that your great-great-great-great-grandparents.
What if you do?
Does that mean that you're indigenous?
Indigenous means being a descendant of a collective that is the pre-colonial identity and has roots to this land that is eternal. So yes.
So the genetics make you indigenous?
No, because there is also a way for which one can become a Native American, one can become a Jew in a really very rigorous process, what people call conversion, but it's really grafting yourself into this ancient civilization. Yeah. You're not indigenous because of your individuality, you're indigenous because of your collective relationship to the land. Tibet, for example, right? Yeah. China took over Tibet and it's today China. There's some that make the argument that, okay, China is the current power, so it's the conqueror and thus it has the right to take the land. And there's some that make the argument, no, the Tibetans are the original people, this is their civilization, and even if they don't have control over it, this is really where they come from and who they are and where they belong. But when it comes to Israel, there's both. We are also the indigenous people and also those who took the land away from the British and were able to liberate our civilization after 2,000 years.
Well, I think that's a lot to argue. Because there were people living in Palestine.
Yeah, and there's still Palestinians living there.
Yeah, there were lots of Palestinians. And
yes.
If you take a look at the demographics, I'm sure you're familiar.
Sure.
That the Israelis or the Jews coming from the West have been supplanting the Palestinians who were already living there.
I would say that in 1948, the British, which this is exactly what they did everywhere they colonized, divided and conquered. They forced the Jews to experience the Palestinians as their enemy and the Palestinians to experience the Jews as their enemy.
Yeah.
And because of that, in 1948, we fought a war. There were Jews that were displaced, there were Palestinians that were displaced. And what we see today with the conflict is the consequences of that war never ending and us never realizing that we both have connections to this land and we need to come together to live and to create something because there's no reality where either population will disappear. Yeah. So I would say that what happened in 1948 is first, the Jews kicked off the British. They literally terrorized them until they left. Yeah. And then because of what they had done, we fought each other, which if I was around there, I would have been fighting for us not to fight each other because they're my cousins. I much more relate to a Palestinian than any other person in this world.
Yeah. I'm still more on the first thing. Because
sure.
Humans originally were nomadic. Like habitat and these first settlements only appeared 5,000 years ago, something like that, 6,000 years ago. So prior to that, would you say that there were no indigenous people?
Mm-hmm. Well, we can go all the way back. That before that we were other species of humanoids, and eventually evolved to being Homo sapiens. Yeah. But at some point, cultures were born. So then the question I'd ask back to you is: would you say that to a Maori in trying to tell them, well, although originally there were no indigenous people to Maoris before, does that mean that it invalidates their indigenous connection to the land? And I think you would say no. So it's like, why apply that standard on the Jews when that's not applied to other indigenous peoples?
Do you believe all people are indigenous to somewhere?
They can be. I think there's some people who, unfortunately were born out of consequences of wars that have happened in different places and don't know where their origins, like a lot of people of color in America, have no idea where their ancestors were from, what language they spoke, what tribe they came from, what culture they practiced. So unfortunately, some people may not be a part of a collective that is indigenous.
Yeah.
For me, it's collectives that are indigenous, not individuals. And individuals only indigenous because they are parts of that collective.
Okay.
So yes, there are individuals that don't fall into a group that is an indigenous person, but we're all human beings either way.
Okay, so would you say that being indigenous gives you more right to a land than being a national?
I would say that being indigenous gives you a very important relationship to that land, and different indigenous peoples practice their culture differently. So for example, Native Americans don't view that they own the land, they view that the land owns them. That's their relationship with the land. They don't want necessarily a government, but they do want access to their lands. Whereas other peoples like Tibetans do want a sort of liberation, or the Polynesians that had a queen do want that liberation. So each indigenous peoples practices their expression of their culture differently. I can speak on behalf of the Jewish people that for us, we do need sovereignty on this land, but throughout Jewish history, we've always had non-Jews living there as well. And we believe we should be a civilization that allows others to live equally within our civilization.
Okay, but how would you argue that Israelis are an indigenous people rather than a national state?
Because, so it depends what we define as the Israeli people. For me, when I say Israeli people, I don't mean people who have a passport that says Israel on it. I mean the living and breathing descendants of this ancient Hebrew, Israelite, Judean civilization that are what we call Jews or Israelites or Hebrews, different names during different periods. This people, regardless if you have a piece of paper that says Israel on it or not, a passport, are this civilization. So for me, I'm an Israeli because I'm a Jew, and I'm a Jew because I come from Judea, and I'm an Israeli because I come from Israel. These are all different names, but talking about the same people. Now, Palestinians, something that many people don't talk about is that 30 to 60% of them actually descend from Jews themselves that were converted to Islam or Christianity over the years. So they also have this heritage that has been passed down genetically and also culturally. And their relationship to the land is very much so real. That I would say is more of a native connection because it's more individual based than the pre-colonial identity that stems from the first people. If you're Palestinian by nature, you're the post-colonial identity because Palestine was the name after Israel and Judea. So I do think that they have a very strong relationship to the land. I don't think it has to be used as competition. And my view is that this land belongs to both of us, and we need to create a reality that functions for both. And unfortunately, what we see happening on a lot of college campuses is they take being pro-Palestinian, which I am also, and use that to say, oh, well, Jews don't have a right to that land. And that's when it becomes problematic, because now we're using each other's identity and connection to fight each other rather than to bring that together and move forward.
What does a right to the land entail for Israelis?
So for the Jewish people, we need to have our own sovereignty, so not falling under the British or the Ottomans or the Byzantine or the Romans or the other colonial forces that were there before. We need to establish our culture here, so a culture that's based more on like the values that we have. So we can say do not kill, do not steal, no idolatry, tzedakah, giving charity to one another, caring about the human beings, caring about animals, caring about the pollution. Those are the values that are ancient Hebrew values and the type of civilization we want to create. Unfortunately, what I currently see as an Israeli, I live in Israel, what I currently see in Israel is we sort of have a westernized style country with Hebrew and Jewish stars and the Jewish people, but it's not systemically Jewish. And that's a more conversation from within of, okay, we've decolonized the land physically from the British, but now there's many other stages of decolonization we need to do, decolonizing ourselves spiritually, decolonizing ourselves mentally, even linguistically. We brought back Hebrew. Now we're speaking the language of our ancestors. So the consequence of colonization is not only physical, but also psychological. And because Jews have been colonized for so long, the structure of what is Israel today, to many Jews, is not what should look like. It's the start of a process of returning back to who we are supposed to be.
Right. So do you believe then that the Jews that were returning to Israel or to Palestine after hundreds of years of separation from the land, do you think that those people returning still have the same right to the land as the people currently living there?
Yes, we are the descendants of the original ancient civilization. If you dig in the land, you find our history. If you test the DNA of Jews that had an experience in Europe, in North Africa, in the Middle East, wherever they are, we have the same DNA, right? You can see that we descend from the same civilization, and we've kept that culture, right? Jews pray towards Jerusalem because we believe one day we need to return there. Have you ever seen like a Jewish wedding, or at least maybe in like a movie, when they like smash a glass and yell Mazel Tov?
Yeah.
What that glass smashing is the representation of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans and the promise that the children from this wedding will one day rebuild Jerusalem. So it's been deeply entrenched within our culture for generations to one day, Shana Haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, come back home and revive that civilization, even if we were in displacement.
Okay. I don't know, I feel like the use of the term indigenous sort of tries to paint a picture of Jews as a suppressed minority in a country currently.
Well,
which,
okay, I hear that.
Usually you use that, you mentioned the Maoris. That was the case for the Maoris. They were living on New Zealand and the British came in there and started to oppress them.
Right.
However, in Israel, there were mostly Palestinians, some Jews, some Christians, most Muslims living in this area. The British came in, they did their oppression, and then the Israelis sort of supplanted the British and started their own type of, you call them apartheid state, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, apartheid, first of all, is the term specified to South Africa, and I think the way it's being used is appropriation, because it's not a term general, it's a term specifically South Africa. And South Africa was one state, one government, different laws for different people. In Israel, you have Israel, which everyone has equal rights, Palestinians including. You have Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, which is now a different entity under a different jurisdiction. You have Gaza, a different piece of land under a different jurisdiction. And I don't have rights as an Israeli to go to Gaza or to go to places in the West Bank, and they don't have rights to go in. That's equally unjust. I believe this land should not have borders, and all people, Israelis and Palestinians, should be able to live on it equally. But it's not apartheid, right? Because apartheid would mean one land, one government, different laws for different people. This way you have many pieces of land, many different governments, and different laws based on who you are and what government you fall under, right? People in France not having rights to people to the land of England doesn't mean there's an apartheid. It means it's just two different regions. So yes, it is separate, and it shouldn't be separate, but that doesn't make it an apartheid.
Right. But there are sort of like two different ideas of having right to a land, right? There's
Sure.
self-determination part, and then there's the national state part, right?
Okay.
So which one of these do you think is the most important to Israel?
Self-determination, and the way that self-determination is expressed is different for different peoples. The way that it is expressed for the Jewish people is that we need to have political, military, economic sovereignty over our land. The way in practice in which it looks like is, you can't really judge a people after the Holocaust and being persecuted and being attacked by all sides for them to create the perfect system. It's a system that is flawed, that I don't know one person in Israel thinks that it's the way it should be. So now we have to have a conversation of how do we remove that or change it and evolve into a better system that works for all. So we can criticize the system all we want, which I will agree with that. But the basis for which the civilization of the Jewish people that should exist on this land is not connected to if the system is good or bad. It's connected to if the Jewish people have a right to self-determine on that land or not, which is what I support and what I think all humans should support.
Right. I don't know. I feel like this talk of a right to the land is sort of arbitrary, honestly. It's I don't really see the need, What I've seen is that what the Israelis have been doing with Palestine for the past 75 years has just led to suffering. I don't see how you justify it.
Well, I'm not justifying anything. What I'm saying is that as an Israeli, I'm a human being. You can see I'm a human just like you. I smile just like you, I have family just like you, and I'm not responsible for certain policies that you might disagree with in terms of the government level. The same way the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, if they go and support killing of people that I know, I have friends that have been killed by Palestinians that has been supported by the Palestinian Authority. That doesn't define all Palestinians. So we can't say Israelis as a whole. Now, if we want to talk about certain policies that are wrong, we should specify what they are so that we can work to change it, rather than to use something that may be a problem and then generalize a whole population and make them seem as the source of the problem.
Well, generally, I mean, the settler colonialism is sort of the problem.
Well, it's
and here you try to kind of label yourself as the natives.
Yeah.
Even though historically, like the way that Israelis have been acting in the past 75 years is in a colonial manner rather than an indigenous manner. That's the role that they're playing.
If a Tibetan were to come back and rebuild in their land, would that be called colonialism?
That depends, though. Let's say that Tibet is now mostly empty of Tibetans.
Well, let's give the example that actually exists, where you still have Tibetans living in Tibet. A large amount of them live in diaspora. The Chinese government has taken over the land, and the Tibetan people believe they should liberate their land, which doesn't mean kicking out the Chinese people who have moved in since, or the other peoples who have moved in since, or the Tibetans that eventually became part of other civilizations because they converted out. It means that we support the Tibetans to revive their ancient civilization. There's usually two arguments for rights of land. There's either the indigenous claim, like in the Tibetan side, or we currently have control, we have power, which is the Chinese side. Right? We have the control, we've taken it over, so it's ours. Even if you're the original, it's ours. That's what the Chinese people are saying. And the Tibetans are saying, no, we're the original people. Even if you took our land, if I take your watch, it's still your watch, even if I take it, right? So if someone takes our land, it's still our land, even if someone kicked us out. And on top of that, we've had a constant presence in that land, never a period of time without Jews in that land, even though at some times we were the minority, although in Jerusalem, for the majority of the time, we were the majority. And eventually we came back and took that land, not from Palestinians, but from the British. Now, Jews coming back to Judea and building in Judea is not colonization, it's decolonization.
I mean, do you know who the British took Israel from?
Yeah, the Ottomans.
Yeah. So the Ottomans was also an empire.
Yes.
Ruled from Istanbul. But during the reign of the Ottoman Empire, they had these local autonomous zones that were comprised in, they were in Syria, they were in Saudi Arabia, they were in Egypt, which was a very autonomous one, and there was also one in Palestine. Mm-hmm. And at that time, whilst it wasn't run locally, they did have some forms of local autonomy, and you could call it self-determination, but it wasn't really an empire. So, and then, of course, they were conquered by the British, who were more of an outsider force. So decolonizing, what would that even mean at this point? There's no strong national identity. They don't have this sort of nationalism movements that were in Europe during that time.
Yeah, so I don't mean decolonizing by removing Palestinians. What I mean decolonizing is removing the British and bringing the native people, indigenous peoples back into the land. So that's what I mean. What's that?
Why do you think that's important?
I mean, why do you think it would be important for Maoris to come back to the lands if they were displaced from the land? Because it's like their soulmate. They see this land as who they are. So Jews coming back to Judea is not colonization, it's decolonization.
Well, I think everyone should have the right to go and live where they want to, right?
On a certain extent, like I can't just go and set up shop in your house, right?
Yeah.
There's certain limits to that. I do think that borders should be a little bit more open than what they are, but there's also limits. Like, for example, people coming into the country, there should be a vetting system that allows, you know, if someone is like a huge criminal and is trying to leave this country that he's committed crimes in, or she, and go to this country, that country might want to think twice before letting that person in. That I understand. So there's certain nuances that should be agreed on, but definitely those who should be allowed into the country are those who have a relationship with that land, which in the case of Israelis and Palestinians, we do, which is why I support us to be able to go, which is why I moved back. I was born in the diaspora. I was born in France. All of my grandparents were born in different countries, in Morocco, Algeria, and in different places where they had been persecuted for being Jews. And so it's very clear to me that Morocco was an experience. Algeria was an experience. Poland, Russia, Ethiopia, Yemen, wherever we lived, that was an experience that we had externally to our land as the descendants of an ancient civilization that was displaced, with always the intention of returning back home. And that's what we started to do in 1948. Unfortunately, there was war, and we're living with the consequences of that today that we still need to heal from and grow out from. But the very concept of Jews returning to the land is decolonizing. It's returning back home. It's Native Americans going back to their native lands. It's not foreigners coming and taking lands that's not theirs. It's the natives coming back home to where they belong. So the point of this conversation that we're having here, showing the signs that Jews are indigenous to Israel, is not to say Palestinians don't have a connection, or they shouldn't exist there, or there isn't a conflict, or people don't suffer. It's to separate. If you are truly pro the Palestinians, don't manipulate the cousins of the Jews' experience to then delegitimize our connection with this land. Those things don't actually fit together, and if anything, they'll fuel to continue this conflict from continuing.
But why would you say it is important to distinguish Jews as being indigenous to?
Because so many people are trying to tell us that we don't belong, whether it's when we're living in Europe, or we're living in Iran, when we're living in all sorts of places. And it's true that we're not from those places, we're temporarily living there. The place that we do belong to is our indigenous land, which is Israel. And now a lot of people are saying that we don't belong there too. And so the reason we're out here speaking about this is because we have a real experience of being told that get out of this land, you don't belong in this land, you don't belong to your native land. So you can imagine any native person that is being told they don't belong to their native land would go out there and trying to communicate with the world, hello, we do, that's where we come from.
Right. Well, personally, I believe you can belong wherever you want.
Sure, by choice, but you would also agree that certain indigenous groups have a relationship with a particular piece of land.
Oh, I don't argue that. But
Yeah.
I just say that they have a stronger claim to the area than anyone else would, I think.
So would you say that, like, since we use this example already, the Maoris, would you say that they have a stronger claim to what is today called New Zealand than the descendants of white Europeans who've moved there? Like, that they have a different relationship?
Well, I'm sure that they have different relationships with land, but I wouldn't say that they have the amount of self-determination over land to treat perceived foreigners anyway that they want.
Okay, so the claim to land for you is based on who currently owns the land.
Yeah, the material conditions that are currently in effect.
Okay, so there's the two arguments I mentioned before. One is the indigenous claim, one is the current owner or control.
It's not an argument from power.
It's an argument from what is the reality,
Yeah.
right? This is what exists, regardless of what people feel, regardless of what people connect or think. This is the reality.
Yeah.
In the case of Israel, it's both. We are also the indigenous people, and we've also come back and taken that land from the British, so it has to be accepted.
Then why is, I still haven't realized, why is being indigenous important?
Well, again, it's just a term, right? At the end of the day, the sounds that we come out of our mouths, what matters what they mean.
Yeah.
What we're saying by saying that we're indigenous is that we have an eternal connection to this land, and we will always be connected to it. We will always see it as our home. Not only is it our father, our mother, our son, and our daughter, but it's also our soulmate. We must be in this land for us to truly be who we are. A Jew outside of Israel is like a fish outside of water, right? It can only survive for so long before it suffocates.
Right, but that makes me curious though. let's say that new historical evidence arrives that the Jews actually immigrated to Judea in the 1st century BC. How would that change your perspective?
Well, what if reality existed that we were all plugged into the matrix and we wake up and everything is fake?
That's not really the same thing.
It is, because you can say that about any native people. But the reality is that the history and the facts and the DNA and the archaeology and the anthropology all points in showing that this is true.
Yeah.
So, if it weren't true for any people, then that would completely change the paradigm. But if it is true, then we have to respect it.
Right, because what I'm trying to point out is that history that is more than 2,000 years old isn't very relevant in discussing how we should deal with modern nations.
But it's relevant to us because we still exist. Most 2,000-year-old people no longer exist.
Yeah.
We still are here. And it's not like 2,000 years ago we paused and now we start again. We've always existed.
Well, yeah, I mean, but all human cultures evolve, right? So,
right, but I wouldn't say the Romans are what today is the Italians,
you think that the Greeks were then the same as the Greeks?
I don't think the Greeks then are the same as the Greeks today.
Do you think the Jews are the same?
Yes, they are.
Really?
Yes. And we view it that way. Like when we have our holidays, I'm sure you've seen Jewish holidays, that's the story of our ancestors from thousands of years ago that we relive. We see ourselves as this was us that we preserve and we maintain, and we've still survived, which is surprising, being that we've constantly been persecuted wherever we are, that we've still pulled through, we still survive, and we still are able to then go to new places and then create success wherever we are, which is the resilience of the Jewish people, which in my opinion I admire very much so. But the reality is that we are still here. It wasn't 2,000 years ago we were people, and now we're coming back to this idea. This idea never stopped. And before 2,000 years, we were people for another 2,000 years. We're very old people, but we're still here.
Okay. No, I mean, I just think it's a bit of a weird claim to take that we're indigenous. Because usually...
Well, I explained to you how I mean the word indigenous.
Yeah.
And by that explanation, I hope you understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
The term indigenous in its definition doesn't say oppression. It's not about people being oppressed. And does it people become no longer indigenous once they achieve their aspirations? So if like the Native Americans, Maoris, all these native people achieved what they seek to achieve, would that remove their indigenous identity? No, because the word indigenous means the relationship that they have with the land. And unfortunately, a lot of indigenous peoples have been colonized and are suffering. And I think that Israel actually represents the most successful indigenous liberation movement that ever existed, which shows a model of light and success to all indigenous peoples around the world that you can overcome. The problem is the West then puts this idea that no, you have to attack Israel because we only want indigenous people when they're suffering. We don't want indigenous people when they're actually strong.
I don't really think that's the argument, though. I mean, most people in most countries in the West are supportive of Israel. However, people are often critical of Israel's treatment of Palestinians. That seems to be the main issue.
In our experience, the West is positioning itself as being pro-Israel, but in practice isn't. I don't see the US being very pro-Israel at all. Like, when did it actually stand up for Israel?
Well, they've been donating military equipment.
And that's exactly the thing. They're not donating money. They're giving credit, forcing Israel to be completely dependent onto the US military-industrial complex. Yeah, and also doing that to Palestinians, not because they care about either one of us, because they want us to keep being in conflict and them to completely supply the weapons and us being dependent on them. See, this is like the image that we get that America is supporting us when it's causing us to be dependent and profiting off of conflict.
They're also giving you money.
No, it's credit. It's credit. It's basically saying, here's our arsenal of weapons. Here's the credit. Go and have a good time. And now the weapon companies are making that money because the U.S. is printing it and giving it to them. And what does it cause with Israel is to be completely dependent. Now that also deal comes with Israel cannot buy or sell any weapons or military technology from any other country but the U.S. without the U.S.'s approval. So now we're completely trapped. What if tomorrow the U.S. falls? What do we do? And not only that, Israel tried to develop its own planes. There was a program that was it was called Levi, to develop its own fighter jets. The US quickly came and stopped that from happening. Why? Because then we'll be too independent.
Huh. I didn't know that Israel was such a targeted modern day community.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And that's actually the role that Jews have played throughout white supremacy, is always being seen as the face of the oppression, but it's using as a scapegoat. For example, in Europe, they were using the Jews to be the tax collectors. They're not collecting it for themselves, but the experience that you had with the tax collector that's taking 60, 70, 80% of your money that you worked hard for your family, the experience of that is the face of the Jew when it's really going to the top. And that's what you see even in society. Everyone's like, oh, the Jews control Hollywood, the Jews control the media, the Jews. That's the function of a Jew within white supremacy, is to be the face of the oppression when they're just as oppressed as everyone else.
It's ironic that the term scapegoat comes from Judaism.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but I think the major difference we have really is that I don't think people have a certain right to certain rights. I think all
That's
people should deserve equal access to all things on the planet.
That's fine. I'm happy and appreciative that you're able to come here, express your differences in opinion, because I think a lot of people today, because they have different opinions or even sometimes contradictory opinions, feel they can't engage and communicate in dialogue. And I learn from you and you learn from me when we express ourselves. So I'm happy that you're able to come and share that with us.
I was sort of expecting more of an orthodox.
Yeah, no.
You know, the Zionism side.
Yeah, I mean, again, words have different definitions depending on who's saying them. For me, Zionism means the Jewish people should have a right to live there. That's what I say when I mean Zionism. And that doesn't mean other people shouldn't have a right to live there as well.
Yeah.
And I think most Jews view it that way, which is why when they hear anti-Zionism, which those who are projecting anti-Zionism really mean anti the conflict, anti-Palestinian suffering, that's why there's like a dissonance where they're not understanding each other. And Jews are saying, oh, you guys are against our right to live here. And you guys are saying, oh, you guys support the suffering of Palestinians. But if we actually sat down and talked about what we meant, rather than just like being offended by the words, we'd realize that we probably agree on the majority of what we would like to see. And if we focus on doing that, I think our generation could potentially make the world a better place.
Well, this has been fun. Thanks for that.
All right, take care. Thank you for engaging.
Have a nice day.
You too.
Oh, Rudy, thank God. We need help with that one. It's a tough one.
That was a good conversation.
That was a great
It's
conversation.
good. Like, he was like, yeah, you got it right. Like, he admitted.
Uh-huh.
No, I think like
Hope you got all of that.
That was good.
That was great.
This guy just compared us to
How do you
killing
end?
everyone in Iraq.
Yeah.
500,000
This
deaths.
guy?
yeah.
So let's go and
That was a great line.
Bud Light there. Where are all the anti-Israel students?
Sleeping to
Where they at though?
Go Bears! Woo!